Well, what was most remarkable about the organisation was that it existed at all at the time that it did. It was in the middle of the Cold War, and people forget what life was like then. The world was really divided, I mean, massively divided. And that a group of trade unionists could get together somehow and have an international organisation that had unions from the Soviet bloc and from the United States and from Britain and from France and Australia, that didn't turn into a political propaganda weapon for either side, was a remarkable achievement. It was remarkable that they were allowed to do it because, there were the days when if you were suspected of being a communist, you were got rid of. If, on the other hand, you were suspected of being a friend of the West and of the CIA in America, you were got rid of. But somehow they managed to keep this organisation free of that sort of politics and existing and doing a practical job. And it was a remarkable achievement, that.
The FIA's first 20 years was very much marked by the Cold War. And FIA wanted to be independent of the Cold War. One didn't want to be an instrument in that ongoing fight. And as a result, the Americans, as I said, and the Soviet Union were outside FIA. I decided to go visit the Screen Actors Guild there. After all, I was a vice-president of FIA. I could tell them a little about our organization. And I met the two leading personalities in Screen Actors Guild. I just went in at their office at Sunset Boulevard, and without being announced, and they received me, both of them, Jack Dales and Chester Migden. We had a conversation for about an hour or two, and before I left, I got an idea in my mind. I told them that the Nordic group of unions, which were, as I said earlier, cooperating rather closely, that Nordic Union was considering holding a conference on film and television, which was perhaps a brave statement because we hadn't discussed it really back in our countries. But I guessed that we would probably be invited to a conference on film and television. And would they be interested in coming? Well, they said, well, why not? The next Congress of FIA was to be held in Prague. It was one of the Eastern unions should be host of the union, and the Americans who had met Eastern representatives, at least one, had discovered that maybe they were not so dangerous, And also they were a bit curious, I think. So when the Congress was held in Prague, 1967, the same gentlemen, Jack Dales and Chester Migden, came along as observers. The Russians were elected members of the executive committee, and that's the way it is since then.
Because again, the Cold War was a very real thing going on around the world at that point, and the federation in the United States called the AFL-CIO, which is the overall union federation, took the position to all of the unions belonging to the federation that they should not join any international organization that had unions from communist countries because they believed they were not true unions. That was the viewpoint in those days. And so they contacted SAG, that was Screen Actors Guild at that time, when now, of course, SAG-AFTRA, because we merged with another performer union. But they contacted them and said, you should not get involved with an organization like FIA, because FIA at that point was just in the process of taking in a union from Russia. And the leadership of the executive leadership of the union at that time, who was Jack Dales and Chet Migden, they ultimately they resisted that directive from the AFL-CIO, which is very unusual to take, to go against your own federation. But they said, no, we really need to participate in this because this organization is apolitical, and this organization is really dealing with the issues that we need to deal with on an international basis. So despite intense pressure, they said, no, we are going to go off and do it. They had the strong support of the board of directors of the union, which was a good thing. And, I think it's laid the groundwork for really the ability of both the Russian Union and the U.S. Union, along with obviously many others, to be able to work together and to put aside all the political differences and concentrate on the issues that were going to affect performers. It isn't like there weren't attempts to bring political issues into FIA, because they were. Resolutions would be introduced, I can remember in the early days, that were highly political in context. But somehow the resolutions committee, when they dealt with them, found a way to modify or suggest that the resolution get referred back to some group to do that. And, that's another person I would just like to comment on, who is Peter Plouviez from Equity in the UK. And Peter was a master at finding ways to solve all of those kind of problems. And I was so impressed with his style of how to lead, and usually with humor and good grace, and yet always produce the results. My first experience with FIA was back in 1984. And that was a conference that was taking place in Moscow. And so I and Ken Orsatti, who was the chief executive of the union at that time, went to Moscow for this conference. And one of the things that was fairly interesting about that particular conference, which I remember very well, was that was a time when, of course, there was a lot of Cold War tension between the U.S. and Russia. And Russia had pulled out of the U.S. Olympics the year before this conference. So when we are at the conference, Ken says, we ought to skip one of these lunches and go to see Red Square because we may not have time to do that. So a few of the U.S. delegation, actually all the U.S. delegation, basically, went off to see Red Square rather than sit through the lunch. And the problem was that we underestimated the time, so we were very late in getting back to the conference. The Russians believe we had actually walked out of the conference in protest of the Olympic pullout the year before. And so, it became, all of a sudden, everybody at the conference was talking about, this big political statement that the U.S. had made. When we finally called to say we were on our way back, and of course, everybody at that point had a great laugh over this. But, it was a sign of both the times, but also how FIA was really able to get past all of those things and concentrate on its own work.